this lecture, we discuss one of Sexual Citizen's 3 key concepts, sexual citizenship. This includes defining it and then sharing an example from the book of how it's useful to understand both sexual assault and sex on campus more generally. We also do something which we don't do in the book, which is to situate the idea a bit in relationship to a range of ideas in social theory. I want to begin with a content warning because, as in the book, in this lecture, we describe sexual assaults as students recounted them to us. This material can be hard to hear. It was hard for us to hear, and of course, harder even for many of the students to live those experiences. If you need to take a break while listening, of course, do so. And if you want to talk to someone, you should call the RAIN hotline. That's 1-800-656-HOPE or 1-800-656-4673. In any room, and even in any virtual or in person, there are almost always survivors. And for those survivors listening along, please know that you're not alone. In Sexual Citizens, our second concept is actually the title of the book, Sexual Citizenship. And it denotes the acknowledgement of one's right to sexual self-determination and the recognition of equivalent rights in others. Sexual citizenship isn't something some are born with and others are born without. Instead, sexual citizenship is fostered and institutionally and culturally supported by communities. As an idea, sexual citizenship focuses attention on how some people feel entitled to other people's bodies and others don't feel entitled to their own bodies. Young people today in America overall are subject to a range of messages that deny their sexual citizenship. Think about sex ed. And even if it does teach about contraception and disease prevention, almost all of it includes the messages that the best choice is to wait until people are older. One of the things that young people told us again and again when we talked to them about their sex ed was how it was not really education in sex, but education in the risks of sex and how they should really try and avoid that. Parents, whether they're freaking out about childhood masturbation or telling them in high school, not under my roof, regard their children's sexual coming of age with something of kind of disapproval and horror. And even more intense, we see this for queer youth, for the LGBTQ plus community, who face a variety of erasures. In popular culture, they don't really see representations of themselves. In sex ed, their experiences aren't really spoken to. And there's a kind of cis heteronormativity to the everyday life of high school, wherein they don't fully develop a sense of their own right to say yes to sex and a recognition of other people's equivalent rights. This is not just about the illegitimacy of their sexual desires, it's about their invisibility as human beings. So I want to tell you all a story that sort of captures some of the ideas of sexual citizenship and how it is that that relates to the broader framework of the book. This is a story about Lucy and Scott. So, Lucy lived a kind of relatively sheltered life before coming to college. And like many young students, she hadn't had a lot of sexual experience before she arrived on Columbia's campus. And this was something she wanted to fix. It was something she wanted to do something about. She kind of had a plan. We talked to a lot of students, and they sort of all have plans about how they're going to address some of what they see as their own shortcomings. And, Lucy's story involved, meeting boys, making out with them, boys as she described them, and eventually having sex. And one evening, early on in her freshman year, Lucy was with her friend Nancy, and they found themselves at a bar. They'd gotten in pretty easily because the local bars on campus or just off campus let women in at pretty high rates, even if they had bad fake IDs or kind of no fake IDs, because they knew it was a way to get men in there who were going to buy more drinks, etc. And Lucy's really having fun at this bar, and she and Nancy end up kind of flirting with some guys. And one of the guys she ends up flirting with is Scott. And, they kind of are making out on the dance floor and dancing close to one another. And in this moment, Lucy's like, my vision is coming together. My sort of college project and what I want it's starting to happen. And she and Scott asks her, hey, do you want to leave and go back to my place? And Lucy sort of knows what this means for her. And she says, yeah. So she and Scott leave the bar, and they sort of wander up Amsterdam Avenue towards the fraternity house that Scott lives in. And they stop for a little bit to make out on the street before walking up the steps. And Jennifer is going to continue this story.
So they walk up the steps to the fraternity. By then, Nancy, Lucy's friend, has caught back up again with them. Scott wasn't super excited about waiting for Nancy, but Nancy had gotten that bystander training, and she wanted to make sure that her friend was going to be okay. And so they stumble into the fraternity. Scott offers to make the girls drinks, girls, of course, because that's what many people refer to women as on college campuses. Fraternities can't, they're not allowed to have hard alcohol. And so the solution to that is not to not have hard alcohol, but it's to keep it upstairs. And so they ascend to the second floor of the fraternity. Remember, Nancy and Lucy are freshmen and Scott is an upperclassman. So they go up to the second floor. He makes them drinks. Nancy immediately passes out. She just was so drunk. Scott invites Lucy up to his room, and she goes with him. And up until then, it seems like this is what she had planned, what she wanted. But then they're in his room making out, and he starts to take her pants off. And she says to him, "No, don't." And he responds, "It's okay." So when he says to her, "It's okay," he's speaking to her from a land where her desires literally did not exist, where her claims to her own bodily autonomy were illegible. He's saying, "It's okay because I want this. It doesn't matter that you don't want it." So stepping back, how can we understand that encounter in relation to the idea of sexual citizenship? Just to make it entirely very obvious, Scott is failing to recognize her sexual citizenship, her right to sexual self-determination. To back up and sort of contextualize this a little bit in relation to the ways that the notion of sexual citizenship has been deployed more generally, there is a whole body of work on sexual citizenship, and a lot of it actually is about something else. It has to do with the ways in which the state confers rights on people depending on their sexuality. For example, marriage equality enabled LGBTQ people to access rights to inheritance or to green cards, rights that have nothing to do with sex necessarily, but where power and privilege were unequally allocated in ways that depend on sex. So it's citizenship depending on sex. That's sort of, I would say, actually most of the way in which the concept is deployed. Our work draws on an important and really different valence of the term sexual citizenship. It's a more cultural and less legally oriented mobilization of the idea. It's focused on the recognition of people as legitimate sexual actors. If you think about all of those erasures that young people are subject to, the "not under my roof," the parental freaking out when children masturbate, that is a denial of young people's sexual citizenship. And the choosing sexual citizens as the title of our book is really, it's a provocation, because our goal is to push people to think about how, in order to effectively prevent campus sexual assault, that has to begin with recognizing young people as legitimate sexual actors. So other groups of people whose sexuality has been erased or regarded as not socially legitimate include not just queer people and young people, but also the disabled. So there's a whole other body of work on sexual citizenship in the way that we mean it, focused on seeing disabled people as sexual people. An emphasis in the way that we use the concept of sexual citizenship is on socialization, because think about Scott. Like, if our only analysis is to judge Scott, well, that's not really analysis, that's judgment. And I mean, I think that there is something satisfying about thinking to yourself, well, Scott is a terrible person, but that doesn't necessarily lead us to solutions. I think a broader take is to think about, well, where did Scott learn to ignore women's voices? We heard so many stories, many of which are recounted in the book, about heterosexual cisgender encounters in which women are socialized to question their own sexual citizenship, and men have been socialized to ignore women's. That's one of the reasons that we emphasize sex ed, not so much for the information that it can deliver, but as a social policy lever that fundamentally acknowledges young people's right to sex. So there are also other relevant social policies. You could think about access to birth control or abortion. I think the politics around both in relation to young people are fundamentally about regulating young people's sexual citizenship. Unlike sexual projects, which we see as an individual moral choice, sexual citizenship is a social project. And what we mean by that is that it's a project that can be fostered by society. A way that the concept is useful not just to understand sexual assault, but to understand sex that isn't assault, but that involves treating the other person like an object or is characterized by a mutual acceptance of a one-way flow of pleasure. We're not saying that sex is wrong necessarily, but it's worth thinking about it as a training ground for overlooking other people's sexual citizenship. Let me unpack that a little bit. So for example, it was not uncommon for young women, heterosexual women, to tell us stories of encounters that consisted entirely of giving blowjobs to men. And for heterosexual men, that was a very normalized kind of encounter. Like there's a story in the book about sex in the library stacks where Pratish gets, I can't remember if it was a blowjob or a hand job, but he gets some kind of it was like a one-way sexual transaction or interaction from a woman. If you think about eating together, like imagine that you had a friendship where you would meet a friend regularly for a meal, but at that meal, only one of you would ever eat and the other one would always cook. So obviously that would seem like an unequal social interaction. And so we argue in Sexual Citizens that this one-way flow of sexual pleasure is actually part of the social context of campus sexual assault in a way that is much more specific than a sort of broad gesture towards toxic masculinity or rape culture. If people learn by doing, then an interaction in which there is only a blowjob, and I mean, we're not anti-blowjob, but we're just trying to think critically about this. That kind of interaction erases women's desire to be anything other than pleasure givers and absolves men of the obligation to reciprocity. One thing that we just want to highlight here, and there's much more discussion of in the book, is the importance of thinking intersectionally about sexual citizenship. Gender is not the only axis of social inequality that shapes whose sexual citizenship is recognized and whose is erased. In the interviews that we did, every single Black woman that we spoke with had experienced unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching. And we always think that bears repeating, every single one. And so you can't understand that without looking at racism and seeing how racism erases the sexual citizenship, but teaches people to disregard Black women's rights to physical autonomy, teaches people that other people's bodies are available to them for sexual exploration without having to ask for their consent. So that is sexual citizenship as a way of thinking about the social context of not just campus sexual assault, but also sex.